Moscow Conservatory in 1898, born in 1880. So, but she had such a great influence on the lives of the pianists that were successful. Some have passed on. Van Cliburn, John Browning, Tony Hahn, which is an interesting story. You remember about Tony Hahn? Do you remember the story about him? He was brought over by General Walker from Korea. A young man, in the devastation of the time, it was just after the Korean War, but he showed some kind of gift for playing the piano, and my goodness, he brought her to her, and she said, I will take him. And he had an incredible, and still is teaching, he's still with us. Incredible, incredible career. So she's had a tremendous amount of influence, and it's time for us to honor her. There's a Leczetitsky Society, and why should there not be a Levine legacy for Rosina Levine? And we're going to have an international piano competition, and we hope that you will be some judges for that, in 2020, and Anthony says that's because she had vision. That's not the only reason. You have to have at least 2 years to put together an international competition. So I think that will be exciting. But we're here today to talk about what she really meant to some of us individually, and then talk about the composers. I was telling them at the first part that, of course, Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, and Joseph Levine all graduated in the same class. Did you hear that part? Yeah. She's extraordinary. This big man, tall man, this little man, and this pianist, right? So the influence that they've had in the pianistic world, the Russians, I have to say, had pretty good fingers, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and we were also talking about the fact how theater and opera and have such an influence on it's not just piano playing, it's life. And if you're talking about life, we're talking about opera.
Yeah, like the Mariinsky Theater in Russia, now the Kirov, they premiered all these famous ballets by Stravinsky, like that we see in the movie Fantasia, you know, the dinosaur part in the movie Fantasia, that's the Rite of Spring. That was premiered in Russia in 1913, 1 year before Stravinsky left. And all these great Russians like Rosina Levine left Russia because of anti-Semitism, and then of course the fall, you know, the Russian Revolution. And because of that, we have, you know, this incredible resource of great teaching like the Levines, who taught, and Rosina, who taught my mother right over here. And I called Rosina Aunt Levine.
She was his godmother.
Yeah, yeah, she was, and I called her.
Should I tell him the story how you came into this world? I better not.
Nah, it's too embarrassing. that's when we discuss the medical history. But I was.
It's quite a history.
Yeah. No, I called her Aunt Rosina, and she lived to 96, and I remember her at 96 years old, and I played violin for her, and People magazine showed up and did an interview with her, and I was there, and that was my first interview. It was People magazine when I was 6.
She really loved you.
She was great. But I think we can all agree that we're in a visual age right now. Everything is, you know, like digital, like movies, TV, film, and I think a lot of these Russian composers were into that. Scriabin was into, you know, even media, multimedia things. I think they took a little bit from Wagner, because Wagner was very much into combining all the arts. Everything must be like opera, ballet, and music, all intertwined. And I think this is what we have with today's movies and musicals. I think if Wagner were alive, he'd be writing film music. You know, we have John Williams, who went to Juilliard, studied with Rosina Levine. He wrote the music to Star Wars and Jurassic Park and Harry Potter. And so everything is just like this huge melting pot and this wonderful mix right now. And I think we owe it to the Russians for a lot of this idea of the visual, you know, like the ballet and opera, which influenced people in this country so greatly. That's why we have Broadway and these wonderful shows in musical theater. It stems from
They're taking a lot from opera. They
Oh, yeah.
changed. It's metamorphosized into that.
Oh, yeah.
They really have. I was telling someone the other day that when I gave a master class out at Montclair, and actually we had a performance afterward, and a composer came up to me and he said, what do you suggest what should I study? What should I do? And I said, well, I would go to every opera you possibly could go to. It's such a wealth of feeling, emotion, organization, communication, that's it. Then everyone said, anyone in particular? I said, all of them. Why would you limit yourself?
That's right.
Absolutely.
All of them, and right, even as pianists, and here today.
What do you mean even?
Yeah, I mean, even pianists try to make this sound like, I think you, and this is I have a good rebound here with you. You have, who was it that said that you play like this, or that you sound like the orchestra when you play?
Well, this is an orchestra.
Right.
I don't think this is a percussionist. It's an orchestra and it's an opera. It's the voices.
Right. And I think the Russian, it's funny what Rosina Levine said about Mussorgsky wrote a piece called "The Pictures at an Exhibition," and every piece is supposed to represent a painting.
And a person's traveling through
the museum.
Through a gallery, through a museum.
Right. And is originally written for piano. And Rosina, Rosina knew, she had great insight into what sounded great, and she said, that piece sounds better with the orchestra.
It does.
Because
there's much more variety.
And it was arranged by Maurice Ravel. And I think that's the beginning. Like Mussorgsky he wrote operas, and he loved the idea of visualizing things. So every piece for that he wrote for piano, and that Pictures at an Exhibition, you were supposed to have a visual for it. And so I think one great thing as an audience member today, and I like to suggest is people, if they can visualize, if this were a movie, or this were an opera or a show or a TV show, what would be happening? You know, because I think a lot of these composers wish they had that technology back then.
Well, they had the best technology they could have.
Yeah.
And so we have what we have.
That's right. But I think a lot of them were dreaming about what it would be. And if they were alive today, I think many of them would be writing.
You think they would have an iPhone?
I think they would. Because they would have their own, their music to play for people on iTunes.
I can see Mozart now. See how high she goes?
That's right.
I have a question.
That's it.
Pictures at an exhibition.
Yeah.
The Gates of Kiev, was that like considered an overture?
The Gates of Kiev is the finale.
The finale. And
Yeah.
the pianist has all these octaves. Right?
Right.
Great,
Which
great
is
piece.
later played by the strings. Like that.
That's right.
Yeah. And
That was very impressive.
Thank you.
Well, tell us your ideas on what you.
Well, speaking of Kiev, actually, one of the things that I found really inspiring was that this sort of Russian tradition of piano education became so global. One of the pieces that I've come to be very intimate with is Khachaturian's Toccata and some of Khachaturian's music, of course.
Yes!
And obviously his name, sounds Armenian, and I always knew him as an Armenian composer. And in looking more, as I started to study some of his music, he was actually considered one of the most famous Soviet composers of the 20th century. And I thought, well, how does that figure? And it turns out that a huge part of that was his education at the Moscow Conservatory, which was also where Yosef Levin and Rosina Levin and Rachmaninoff and Scriabin all were around the same time. And it's just so interesting to see how his identity was so shaped by that education and by that influence, and now kind of how that's trickled down to here in the US and all over the world. It's just astounding to me. I love it.
It is, and as far as the Levin, the Russian tradition of pianists, I mean, you think of the French pianists, which are wonderful, and the German pianists, but all of the pianists, Lang, everyone coming down, they all studied with Russian teachers. There's something in that, and of course it's akin also to the Russian ballet.
Yeah,
Right? It's all
Yeah.
there. So that was an era that was so, what shall I say, influential on what we have today. And I guess you would call it Russian collusion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a romantic tradition. It's the Russian romantic tradition. It's the freedom of tempo, the freedom to express yourself, and I think that's
Then we
Well,
had- don't
Rosina
we
passed
had
on to you. I mean,
Prokofiev.
yeah.
How about Shostakovich?
right? No, yeah, Shostakovich.
Who had a terrible time because
He was stuck. He was stuck there in the Soviet Union. They wouldn't let him leave, and I think. But you hear the emotion in his music. So I think there's always a story to tell with the Russian composers.
And
There's
Prokofiev also stuck.
Prokofiev was stuck there.
He escaped, quasi.
Right, Rachmaninoff made it over. Stravinsky made it here. But I think there's always a story to tell, and I think I think that's what the struggle of these composers are inherent in their music, and I think that's why it's so emotional. It's so deeply emotional because of their struggle to prove themselves constantly to the political regime there.
And
Right.
quite immersive.
And the
Yeah,
Russian,
immersive.
the Russian, the authors as well. There's always that tug and that's tragedy. There's always tragedy.
Right.
I mean, nobody writes a great piece of work about a sunny day.
That's true.
It's got to be raining. It's got to be a storm. Something has to be happening.
That's true, and I think the Russian pianistic, the tradition that Rosina passed on to you, and that you're passing on to your students, it's not just the ability to play Russian music so well, but it's that sense of deep emotion that you can use in any piece of music, not just the Russian school, but even in Mozart, where you're supposed to play with a certain finesse and light agility, but you still Mozart struggled greatly to stay healthy, and he died so young, and just
We visited his grave.
That's right.
Which it doesn't really exist because he was a pauper's grave. But that same spot, have you been there?
Yeah.
And Brahms is there as well, and Beethoven. I mean, when you think their remains are there, you sort of fall on the ground. You think,
Yeah.
oh my God, here we are.
It's one of
But
those
no
things.
eighth notes came up.
If you want to get a picture with it, but do you smile? Do you, it's so powerful to be there. And
It
you're
was
just-
so powerful.
It's exciting to
I
be
mean,
around
anyone
it.
who has an opportunity to do that, to go there, it's the proximity inspires you so much. I mean, you really feel that connection. Fantastic, right?
Absolutely. So I think Rosina Levine has taught generations, and now you're teaching generations of students how to incorporate the soul, the anima, as you say.
Yes,
The
that's
soul of...
Star animato. That's a great anima is soul, right?
That's right, all right. So it's really not about the notes. A lot of young pianists come away thinking, did I get all the right notes? It's not about the notes. It's about the freedom of expression, of combining your own soul with that of the composer that you're playing. And it's the spirit.
It's interesting because as you say that, I'm thinking about why there's the technique and the depth. I don't have any Russian blood, so I have no partner in this. But I'm just making observing it. But there's so much there. Think of the authors. There's so much there that you can almost apply it to anything that's left. The fuller the pot, the more it can be distributed.
Yeah.
Emotionally and every other way, technically too. Because speaking about Chopin and Mozart, those recordings of Levine, the Mozart C major,
Right.
you all know it as the Elvira Madigan, but it's so gorgeous, and the Chopin E minor. And someone asked her once, he said, if you only had one concerto to live with and everything else would be destroyed, what would you choose? She said, only I cannot choose Chopin F minor, Beethoven 4. That was her choice. Pretty good choice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. So, I mean, the pieces we're hearing today, we're going to be hearing Beethoven, right? We're going to be hearing the artists, Mozart, Schumann,
And
Rachmaninoff.
Scriabin.
They all have their own personal stories to tell. So I think it's interesting when I hear you all play it, and I heard you earlier. It's so important to know. Like for example, Schumann had, he suffered greatly, with certain an illness. Mozart, at the end of his life, was struggling. I mean, Beethoven lost his hearing at age 30. He knew he was losing his hearing. So I think, like at the time of the Moonlight Sonata and the Tempest Sonata, is when he found out he was going deaf. And so you can hear that in the music. And he wrote a letter to his brothers called the Heiligenstadt Testament, right, where he confessed. And when he knew, he said, this is going to be the end for me. But he prevailed anyway, And so that you can hear it in the music. And I think in the Russian tradition of playing Beethoven and Mozart, we hear the emotion more than ever before, more than the Germans played their own music, more than you hear. I think the Russians wanted to explore the personal side of the composers.
Speaking of which, also going back to sort of the notes and how it's so much more than that, you can see a lot of this emotion not only in the amazing recordings that such people as Rosina Levine left, but also the composition of the works themselves. For example, specifically with Beethoven, actually, I had the chance to study the Eroica Last Movement theme and variations, and everyone, thinks of the Eroica Symphony, this big sort of statement of prevailing over deafness and a kind of response to the Heiligenstadt Testament, and Beethoven kind of saying, I'm not going to let physical impediments deter my art. But yet, in tracing that theme, it's actually in 3 other Beethoven works that are all in the same 4-year period of his life, which basically chronicles the time he figured out he was going deaf through that testament and through his sort of new declaration of art for art's sake. And I think it's interesting because that theme is presented in the same key with very similar instrumentation in every single example. And it's treated in very similar ways. And so it's a pointed kind of placement of the theme because he wants you to recognize it. And if you know the Creatures of Prometheus, when you hear Eroica, suddenly you say, wait, I know that theme, I've heard it before. And it brings back all of these memories and it creates a journey. Right. And I think as a musician, it's just interesting to
No, that's a good point, exactly, a good point. So when you hear the pianist today, let's pay close attention to the composers during that time and know what was in the mind of that composer personally, but also the politics. We're talking about the Russian struggle with the new regime after the Russian Revolution and Stalin and the suppression. And I think with Beethoven, it was the Napoleonic War, the War of 1812. He actually dedicated the Third Symphony to Napoleon. But when he found that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, Beethoven was just disgusted with that act of narcissism that he scratched out the dedication to Napoleon on the page and just as hard as he could make the scratch. It's like it actually tore a hole into his music because he was so angry that Napoleon was out for himself instead of for the people. And it's really relatable to what the Russians were going through in the early part of the 1900s with the Russian Revolution.
Very played a big part, of course.
Right. Rosina Levine, they left Russia because of anti-Semitism, and they went to Germany. They lived for 10 years in Berlin, and then could not leave because of World War I, and had to wait till after until 1919, I think, right after World War I, then to finally move to the United States. Right.
That's right.
And so I think that struggle, also comes across in Rosina's teaching, the struggle of trying to find freedom. And you hear that in Beethoven as well. And I think that their interpretations of these older pieces, they put their own experiences of dealing with the political regime of their day.
It was interesting, you were talking also about Beethoven being deaf. Just imagine, you're all practicing your pieces and you can't hear what you're doing. And I said to myself, well, isn't that a blessing? Because then you have to imagine it. You have to imagine the sound that you want to hear and what you want to do. And so and you think about it, all happened later in their lives, and those were some of the greatest works that they composed. So I think if one would practice imagining that you're something greater than what you've done, that's the way to get to a higher place, I think. Right?
Yeah.
Speaking of higher places, do you think we should let them play now?
Yes. What's first on the agenda?
We've been speaking so much about Mozart. I think we should perhaps hear the fantasy.
And is this written toward the end of his letter?
It was, yes, he didn't finish the last few bars. It was not so it's been added. You could actually do without, but mathematically you need it.
Right.
Maybe coda.
And it's so ironic. It's at the time of his requiem, right? And he
He
didn't know he was. I mean, his illness really kind of came up very suddenly.
Yeah.
But he did travel as a young kid all over Europe, and I think he got had some early illnesses which stayed within him, and just at age 35 he was
didn't
gone.
take care of himself.
Probably didn't. Well, at that time they had no medicine, right? And so, but he ironically wrote a requiem, which is a mass for the dead. He wrote a mass for the
Dedicated
dead,
to his
and
mother.
that was his last work at
Yes,
the
right.
time of this fantasy.
Right.
And the fantasy has it's foreboding in it. It's like F minor. It's like dark, right? It's
Right,
darkness.
it has. But as I said before, our first entree today, that there's so many different facets to his character, and at the ending, I mean, it's like, look at it, it's like La Commedia e Finita in Pagliacci, where he comes out and says after everyone's killed everyone, he says the comedy is finished,
Yeah.
So that's like Giovanni, blah, 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 and he comes out, it's just a play. I just wrote a few notes and said, come on, let's have some fun.
Yeah.
So-
Mozart was always childlike.
Childlike.
Not childish, but childlike. He was like he never grew up. Part of him never grew up because he started at age five or six, and so I think he always played with toy soldiers, and you hear these dotted rhythms in his music, yum bum ba-dum bum all the time, which is like the snare drum. Bum, bum. Yeah, everything.
That's
all-
Schumann.
And Schumann too. Schumann, yeah, and we're going to hear Schumann later as well,
Yes, we
right?
are.
And he has two sides to him as well. He had Florestan
He
and
has-
Eusebius.
Eusebius, right.
He had a split personality.
And
They
there was
did not know.
Master Raro, don't forget, he came in there.
Right. Actually, Schumann had, they didn't diagnose it, but at the time they didn't know, but it was schizophrenia. So you hear this very, we're going to hear the Schumann Sonata later.
First.
You hear this kind of very hyper upbeat quality, like frenetic. And then you hear this sort of kind of very dark, lamenting quality. And like, just like in Mozart you were describing, you have both personalities. Mozart the child, and Mozart the old wise man of 35. And then Schumann, you have this split personality in his music. You hear...
And Beethoven death, there you go.
And Beethoven, well, we hear
It
the...
was happy times.
Yeah, when we hear Beethoven today, he wrote those, you hear the Moonlight and the Tempest today, right? Still?
Right.
He wrote those pieces exactly when he found out he was losing his hearing. And so both those pieces reflect that too. So it's a good program today.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you so much, Mr. Abel.
Ms. Lusky, Mom?
Thank you. It's great. I look forward to your Cacciaturian.
Yes.
And if you say thank you, because I played in Armenia, actually I premiered the Bartok Third. If you could believe it, in Armenia. So we said, what? And then you say, Shiragarayan. Thank you. They all ended IAN, of course.
She plays the Bartok Third. Fantastic. We
yes.
performed it together. I conducted,
That's
and
right.
you played.
Ba-dum,
Ba-dum, ba-da-dum, bum, ya-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-dum.
We're going to do the sing that. It's in two pieces, so be careful you don't want to